itself with the title. The other bill was a new type of license, unlimited. So, Mr. Chairman, the intent was to combine them. The vehicle that seemed to be agreeable to the parties is Senate File 13, the existing bar and grill license, and the modifications there. So in this proposal, Mr. Chairman, and I think at least all the committee members have a copy of it, and I mailed it to, I think, most of the interested parties that were participating in the discussion, is to bring entertainment under the bar and grill. There's a definition, and certainly we can talk about whether the appropriate definition is there. There was a sideboard brought to me by the parties, and maybe it's just best to walk through the amendment, Mr. Chairman. So, Mr. Chairman, this goes to Senate File 13. First thing we do is insert a definition of entertainment, any activity, diversion, or amusement, regardless of age. So we're trying to encapsulate all family type activities. It has a prohibition against adult entertainment. We're leaving that to the local licensing authority, city, town, or county, or gambling. And gambling, of course, is a definition within Title VI. And I have the entirety of that definition. The definition itself is actually not that long, but the exceptions is a very long laundry list. So if there are folks that feel that gambling and want to drop off some of those things, or have a discussion about maybe not all gambling or certain types of gambling, I'm certainly open, and I brought the statutes, and of course we can get access to that. So that, and then the other part of the bill that I think, and this is the remainder of the amendment, just allows food services and entertainment, or a combination thereof, to be part of the 60%. That's the entirety of the bill. The final thing that it does, Mr. Chairman, and this is done, and some of the folks that we visited with didn't think it was as necessary as I did, so I guess I got to draft the amendment, so I did it. Is I actually broke out entertainment and food sales separately in the reporting requirements for their annual renewals and for the application, because I think we do want to understand how these are being used, what we're actually seeing in the short term and long term. Because as you know, Mr. Chairman, while this bill has some increases in numbers, it may not go to the extent that some of the proponents would want it to for entertainment. But if in time we see that this entertainment actually is, there's more interest than we realized, hopefully the parties that are all interested in this would come back and say, let's bump it a couple more for whatever purposes. So, Mr. Chairman, that is the entirety of the amendment, and I'll be glad to stand for any questions at your leisure. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator, and thank you so much for your work. Questions for the Senator? Any questions from the committee? Well, let's get some reaction from folks out in the audience. Fresh meat.
Mr. Chairman, April Brimmer Coons on behalf of ACES Range.
And J.B. Kuntz as well, representing ACES Range, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee.
We stand in full support of the amendment. We appreciate the hard work. We appreciate Senator Scott for allowing this opportunity through his original amendment. We believe in this amendment blended into bar and grill, and the actual impact is that we could go before our city council, which is our local authority and governing body, and apply for a license for ACES Range. And we would go through everything that needs to be done, and at the end of the day, they would either give it to us or not give it to us, but it would be one of the bar and grill licenses. So in the sense of they would lose a bar and grill license for a restaurant, and it would go to ACES Range. So what this does, it's not everything we had hoped for. You never receive everything you hope for. But it helps a concept to get a start, grassroots economic development. Hopefully it will expand, and we'll be talking about economic development again. But for now, This is adequate and very helpful, and we appreciate this. We stand in favor of the amendment and of Senate File 13. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Questions for a second? I think Senator Scott can't, he's always wanted to ask you questions. Go ahead,
Sorry,
Senator
Senator
Scott.
Scott.
Mr. Chairman, the question I have is, it's not only your operation, the ACES range, but there's a number of others, that you talked about in this town that have projects that need licenses. If we pass the bill with this amendment in, will there be enough licenses to go around to meet the need that you're seeing?
Ms. Coons.
Mr. Chairman, Senator Scott, there will be, because you have to have your building in place, and many of those who were applying did not have everything in place yet, including ACES range. And so I believe that it will be, and I believe that the council will be willing to look at things when everybody is ready to go. The benefit right now for several communities that I'm personally aware of are the movie theater in Laramie. The YO is owned by the city of Laramie. I have visited with their delegation in both the Senate and the House, and they are thrilled with this opportunity that they maybe can have a venue in their movie theater. The town of Jackson also has a movie theater, and Senator Landon, the Sand Trap, which is golf simulators, already open in Casper and doing business, I think would be very interested in this also. So we see it as a statewide initiative, and no, it's not going to solve all the problems right now, but it certainly encourages people to go ahead and do their renovations and take blighted properties and turn them into something valuable for the community. Thank you for the question, Senator Scott.
Good. Senator Barlow.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So the committee will recall that we were provided the breakout of the additional licenses on the original bill, within the original bill. We've not changed the language that has this two-stage incremental increase and then removes the cap. So to Senator Scott's inquiry, Cheyenne, the city of Cheyenne would receive 7 additional this coming July. The city of Laramie will increase by 4. And then you can go down by the community that may be interested and go through and see what adjustment there may be, Mr. Chairman. But I think it is helpful when you talk to constituents or our colleagues talk to their constituents, does this impact your community or not in its current form? And many of them, I think that we've heard, are seeing an increase. Now, I don't know if it's enough for them, but we are incrementally increasing them. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
I'm sorry, anything else for these witnesses? Thank you very much. Who else would like to join in this kumbaya moment? Mr. Mosier, Mayor Collins, Mr. Fraser. Who's going first? I think they were reluctantly, but Mr. Mosier?
Mr. Chairman, members of the committee, Mike Mosier, Wyoming State Liquor Association. Thank you to all of you, especially Senator Barlow. We were texting till about dark 30 last night, making sure everybody was okay with this. Admittedly, I read through it. I don't trust my own Juris Doctorate ability because I have none. I've never passed a bar in several different meanings of that term. Sorry, too early. But everyone else, including the Liquor Division, seems to say it says what I think it says. Admittedly, I have not had time to vet it by my board because it was pretty short notice. I think they'll be okay. I mean, it's a tough compromise, but I think it's a good compromise. And if my board is not okay, the mayor of Cheyenne has assured me that their sanitation positions, they have a few open and the benefits are great. The advantage is this doesn't open a floodgate. As was mentioned by Senator Barlow, Cheyenne, for example, gets 7. Now, one thing to bear in mind, committee, is that we have always worked closely with our friends in municipalities. And if this turns out to be an economic boon and there's all sorts of opportunities, we'll revisit it. And the other thing we may need to revisit, some of you know about House Bill 148, which airport liquor licenses, and one airport decided that their airport liquor license shouldn't go in the terminal, it should go in a packaged liquor store clear on the other side of the runway. And so 148 says something we didn't think you'd need to say, which is it needs to be in the terminal. And we may find instances like that with this, where there's a loophole that we missed, and we'll revisit this. This will be an ongoing process over the years. But in summary, committee, I think it's okay for our retailers. My concerns about us outrunning our coverage for what our communities can handle and what our law enforcement community can handle, I think that's taken care of here. But as I mentioned, this will be an ongoing process. We'll monitor everything. And I'd also like to thank my colleagues and friends with Wham and April and everybody else, because I think this was a good cohesive effort, and I went down kicking and screaming, but we found a good solution. Thank you, committee.
Thank you, Mr. Mosier. Anybody have a question for Mr. Mosier? Thank you, Mr. Mosier. Let's go to you, Mr. Mayor.
Good morning, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee. Thank you very much for this. I learned a few things. I was here yesterday and talked about I'd like to see these kept as separate bills, but there's a sign behind my desk that says assume positive intent, right? And I think this is a much more simple solution that takes two bills and makes it one, which I think we have a better chance of getting through the legislature. It meets a lot of what we wanted to do. When we came to the committee the first time, we were asking for a tavern license, and which would be basically a pub. Senator Scott came up with the entertainment part, and while it's not exactly what we asked for, it's something that we can do that I think really fills a niche in the community, which is we have the restaurants, now we'll be able to have some fun, hopefully entertainment type of things. And so I think this is a real simple solution. It's a simpler bill, and if I were in your seat, I would probably appreciate simple. Short is easy. So I learned something. Thank you very much, and I will do my best to see this thing get passed.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Questions for the mayor? Thank you, sir.
Mr. Chairman, if I
Yes.
could, to answer Mr. Scott's question earlier, do we think we have enough? We have 14 bar and grill licenses today, and from 2006 to today, we've sold 14 bar and grills, 4 of those in the last year. 7 more. I hope it's not enough. I hope that means we got a lot of new restaurants, a lot of fun things. We're going to come back and talk to you guys again for more, but I think for the short term, I think that number works real well for us, and if it doesn't, you'll get to see me again.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Senator Landon.
Thank you. Good morning, Mr. Chairman. Thank you. Mr. Mayor, quick question. Do you have any concerns that this will marginalize in any way those restaurant licenses? It seems to me that the local authorities going to have to be a little bit discerning, a little bit careful. But this at least opens the opportunity for a little bit different kind of establishment. Any concerns about those restaurant licenses?
Mr. Chairman.
Just if I might interrupt just before, I think we all should remember that there's a difference between bar and grill and restaurant. Bar and grill are limited. Restaurant's a little bit different. So we keep blending them together like they're the same license with the same limits, and they are different. So if you would help us with that, Mr.
I didn't mean to
Mr.
stub
Mayor.
my toe.
No, sir.
Hope you know
Mr.
what-
Chairman, through you, we have restaurant liquor licenses, and in a restaurant liquor license, you don't get to have a bar where you can sit at the bar and have a drink. You have to go to a dispensary room, grab that drink, and bring it to the table. A bar and grill, there's a bar inside the restaurant that you can sit at and have a cocktail or something like that. And I guess I take it a different approach. I think it makes the bar and grill more valuable because now we have additional entrepreneurs who have an opportunity to use that license to open a business. And so I don't think it's going to marginalize it. I think actually it makes that license more valuable to us. Because there's going to be a lot more people like Aces Range behind us who we've not been able to help. We're out of retail liquor licenses, and we're not able to help them. We'll be able to help them, and I think other businesses similar to them be able to get in and get going. So I look at it maybe the opposite. I think it makes it more valuable.
Thank you. Appreciate it.
Okay, anybody else for Mr. Mayor? We're good. Mr. Fraser, did you have anything to add?
Thank you, Dave Fraser, Executive Director, Wyoming Association of Municipalities. Nothing really to add other than say thank you to the committee and Senator Barlow in particular, and to thank our colleagues at the Liquor Association. I think it is a better way to do business to get together and compromise and find something that works for everybody rather than just come have you guys referee. So I want to thank Mike for working so well with this as well. So And that's all I have unless there's any questions, Mr. Chairman.
Senator Scott.
Mr. Chairman, I want to make a general comment. Mr. Chairman, I would like to compliment all the parties involved in this for getting together and working out and agreeing to a reasonable compromise, and thank our colleague Senator Barlow for facilitating that. I think this is an example, Mr. Chairman, of legislating and the process working well. So my compliments to everybody concerned. I think everybody was an adult and willing to be cooperative, and I appreciate it.
I do as well. So anything else to add? And Mr. Fraser, thank you very much for the book that you presented to the committee, 13 Ways to Kill Your Community. Hopefully, we're not doing that right now. All right, who else would like to address us? The Liquor Division isn't here, right? Montoya, you were here. There you are. We okay? Got a thumbs up from the Liquor Division. Would anybody else in the room like to address the committee on these, kind of where we're going here? In essence, we're probably going to have a positive vote with an amendment on Senate File 13, and we will then decide what to do with Senate File 12, which is not going to get a do-pass recommendation. We'll decide about that. Is there anybody online? Nobody online? I'm not seeing any more testimony, so the question is, Senator Barlow.
Mr. Chairman, so one of the discussions that came up in our initial meeting, and I see Mr. Odikoven from Wascop here, was about food sales. And one thing I did not bring into this bill was ensuring there would be food sales. And what I guess I'm interested in, and this is, from the committee as we consider the bill, and for the proponents, or I guess we can call them all proponents now of the amendment, is think about whether we want to, that there has to be some minimum amount of food, or does the bill just allow the municipality or the licensing agency to accomplish that on their own and say, look, when you come to us with a license, it's going to be our policy that you have food available, whether you have a commercial kitchen in-house or you have a access from the outside with a vendor or something. I just want to be clear that when Ms. Parsons was here the other day, that she felt that was an important component in trying to manage some of the ill effects that we have when we have intoxicating beverages. So anyway, Mr. Chairman, I just want to throw that out there. It's not in this bill. I did not say that it has to at least have 10% food or anything up. I just want that portion of that conversation to be out there to make sure we at least acknowledge the point that was raised by Ms. Parsons and Mr. Odikoven. Anyway, thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator, and that's something I've been thinking about. Mr. Odikoven, would you be able to talk to us about that? So I think the concept is, do we have any requirement for some food in some way, whether it's frozen pizzas? We're not trying to specify it, but thoughts about that? And then Senator Scott, I see you got your hand up. Can we hear from Mr. Odikoven first? Okay, thank you.
Mr. Chairman, thank you. Byron Odikoven, the Executive Director of the Wyoming Association of Sheriffs and Chiefs. Thank you, Senator Barlow, for referencing our earlier testimony. We covered two aspects, of course, the population density when it comes to alcohol distribution and the impacts that may have on a community, and thus law enforcement, and then community budgets. And we talked about supporting local cities, towns, and counties in terms of budgeting to help compensate for policies that the legislature makes as well. Specifically to food, we know from national information as well as local information to some extent that when food is involved, we seem to have less issues and problems over the course of the evening and into the night. So I think it is fair to say to the local authorities that food should be a consideration in some of that discussion going forward, recognizing that very important fact that food can play a very significant role in the total outcome or calls for service, recognizing that nearly half of our calls for service involve alcohol. So, Mr. Chairman, thank you for that point. And I would certainly hope, as I said, that the local authorities would consider food as they consider the expansion to the licenses, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Odikoven. We're going to hear from Senator Scott. He may or may not have a question for you, but Go ahead. Senator Scott.
Mr. Chairman, it would seem to me that it was safe to leave that to the discretion of the
Mhm.
local authorities, and I would think as long as we didn't, as long as nobody specified that it had to be a commercial kitchen and all that sort of thing, it would seem to me natural for these places to want to sell snacks that, the sort of thing you can get pre-wrapped and don't have to cook on site, or have a popcorn machine, or there's any number of ways you can provide food, and it may depend on what your clients really want. But I think if we can leave that safely open to the local authorities, Mr. Chairman, I'm afraid that we start specifying it, sooner or later, it might acquire restrictions that will make it not work as well for everybody.
Thank you, Senator Scott. Anybody else on that point? Mr. Odekoven on that point?
Mr. Chairman, I certainly recognize that in terms of a business model and going forward, there's a cost benefit to doing that expanded level of service. Then it becomes an issue for the local governing authority to decide if that cost benefit outweighs the expense that the city would have in having those additional facilities operate within their community. So, Mr. Chairman, I think it will be a lively discussion in some areas of the state.
Okay, thank you very much, Mr. Odekoven. Anybody else like to address us on this point? All right, not seeing anything. Committee, so I think, I'm not sure if we got a motion on either bill, but just to make sure, I think we should get a motion on Senate File 13, and then let's amend it.
I'll move it.
Got a motion by Landon, and who would, Senator Barlow, would you move your amendment?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So, Mr. Chairman, I'd move amending Senate, is this a second reading amendment number 3? No, this is proposed amendment to the bill as provided to you, and I will provide a copy to staff. Move that amendment for adoption.
Okay. You've all got a copy of the proposed amendment. Is there any appetite for inserting a food requirement? Senator Landon?
Mr. Chairman, thank you. I've not weighed in on this front, but I just also wanted to tip my Stetson to the senator from Campbell County. Started with a conversation up on the chamber floor, and we both looked at each other and thought, you know, there's got to be a way we can combine this. And then I just stood back and watched the senator do the good work. It's a really nice job of pulling this all together, and appreciate everybody out there allowing me to be able to get to both of these issues. And I think this is a great opportunity. I do not believe, I share the opinion of my fellow senator right here. I don't think we need to govern that. I don't think we need to pull food into this. I think this is a new venture. Let's allow these local authorities to kind of sort that out.
Thank you, Senator Landon. I'm always, I share your thoughts about Senator Barlow, but I'm just between you and me, I'm always kind of hesitant to compliment a freshman because it gives him a big head. Senator Barlow.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I think there is actually, within the amendment, if there is an interest in continuing this conversation about the food services, there's already, and if you look at lines 28 through 31
That's where I'm
in the
looking.
amendment, it'd be very easy to insert and what it currently says is the level and appropriateness of entertainment sales.
Why
That
don't we
is
just
specific.
Why would just go entertainment and food sales?
Yeah, and I think the convention throughout the rest of the bill is food before entertainment, just the way the bill has been structured elsewhere. So I think it would actually, if you wanted to add food services to this and be just direct about giving the local authority, this is something you consider. Right now, we're giving them direct authority over entertainment.
Right.
We might as well give them both, because that's part of the 60%. We might as well say, look, they have, the proponents, the applicants have to come forward and say, this is what we anticipate. And then as you do renewals, then you actually know what happened. And that's part of the reporting requirement that I felt was important. So I think the insertion, Mr. Chairman, I think you were going the same place, but I would put after put food services and entertainment sales.
Does the word services imply some kind of capital or kitchen, or is it, could we just say food and entertainment without the word services? I think that sounds like you could have a food truck at there and arrange for that. Are you, is that friendly?
Mr. Chairman, certainly it's friendly. I'm a freshman, remember, Mr. Chairman?
It's good. Make sure you know your place. So I think the whole thing is friendly, everybody. That he brought the original motion, and he's suggesting that it would be okay on line 29, after the word of, to add the word food and, so that the whole clause 28 through 31 reads, the appropriate licensing authority shall consider the level and appropriateness of food and entertainment sales proposed in each application when determining whether to issue or renew a bar and grill license. Is that a friendly amendment? I've gotten lots of nods from the audience.
I think so.
All right. Should we, did you get that, Debbie? I can make sure you get it. We're just,
Actually, Mr. Chairman, we did not get a copy of that.
ooh,
So we're trying,
That's a
we're over
freshman
here
mistake for
scurrying,
ya.
trying to write it all down. Thank you.
and he can put food and in the right place for you.
Question on the amendment to the amendment? Do you need?
I think it's all friendly, so I think we just have one amendment. Senator Barlow, that in essence is your new amendment, correct? So I would just call for the question. All those in favor of the amendment, say aye.
Aye.
It's all ayes. And then we're back on the bill, and let's have a roll call on the bill, and then let's separately decide what we want to, how we want to dispose of Senate File 12. We could just leave it Land Committee. They're getting a little picky about that. But let's have a roll call on the bill, and remember, I'm going to be a conflict at the end.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Senator Barlow. Senator Boner.
Aye.
Senator Landon.
Aye.
Senator Scott.
Aye.
And Mr. Chairman.
A conflict. So Senate File 13 has passed the committee. You can probably talk to the majority floor leader and get it up anytime you want. So it could probably come up today. I think we're short of bills if you want. So the question remains, what do we do with Senate File 12? Senator Scott, suggestion.
Mr. Chairman, I would suggest that we just leave Senate File 12 alone, put it on the table subject to the discretion of the chairs if we're going to need to ever bring it up. If something goes wrong, it's a backup, but it'll probably just quietly sleep until the end of the session.
So let's get a voice motion on that. Just,
Mr. Chairman, I move we lay Senate File 12 on the table subject to the
call the
call
chair.
chair.
Okay, you've heard the motion. All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? That's carried unanimously. And I guess probably I should be at conflict on that. I'd like to record that if we're going to table a liquor bill. Okay, so thank you very much, you guys. That'll probably clear the room. And our next bill listed, it's been a pleasure working with all you guys. Brent Coons would be very proud of you, sir. You bet. We have listed Senate File 76, Wyoming Digital Asset Registration Act. There's a slight problem with that in that Senator Rothfuss has got a couple of commitments. We will take that up as soon as he can get here. So let's just go a little bit farther down and hear about Senate Joint Resolution 6. Anybody here to testify on that? Anybody here? Well, I'm going to go down the list again if we don't have Senate Joint Resolution 6. That's a committee bill. I guess I could do that. Sorry. I was thinking it was a freshman over there and the other house's bill. We can do Senate Joint Resolution 6.
This was interim, huh? Yeah.
Yes, was the interim bill. This is the free and fair elections, how it came out. I was thinking it was an individual bill, but it's not. All right, everybody. Senate Joint Resolution 6 requests Congress to propose a constitutional amendment identifying the source of political contributions as specified. We'll just go through it. Whereas the United States Supreme Court has ruled that Congress and the states lack authority to ban independent corporate expenditures to political campaigns for public office, relying on the concept that the spending of money to elect a candidate is protected speech. And whereas the United States Supreme Court precedent has allowed the creation of super political action committees, campaigns for public office, which have made campaign expenditures whose source cannot be readily traced to natural persons in unprecedented amounts. And whereas the legislature of the state of Wyoming has grave concerns that corporations have abilities not enjoyed by natural persons, including perpetual life and enhanced accumulation of assets, which may enable corporations to financially overwhelm individual natural persons in the political process. And whereas Congress, state legislators, and local legislative bodies should have the authority to require the identification of the natural person sources of campaign expenditures and to limit expenditures by entities that are not natural persons. And whereas a constitutional amendment would control over United States Supreme Court precedent interpreting the United States Constitution. Now therefore be it resolved by the members of the legislature of the state of Wyoming, Section 1, that the legislature of the state of Wyoming respectfully urges the Congress of the United States to propose and send to the states for ratification an amendment to the United States Constitution to allow the public identification of the source of political contributions or expenditures for or against any candidate, and to limit or prohibit corporations and other entities that are not natural persons from making campaign contributions for or against any candidate. Political expenditures by organizations that are comprised of natural persons and that publicly identify their members and donors should not be restricted. Section 2, that the Secretary of State transmit copies of this resolution to the President of the United States, to the President of the Senate, and the Speaker of the House of Representatives, and of the United States Congress to the Wyoming Congressional Delegation. So that's the bill we passed either in our last meeting or the meeting before. Senator Scott, a lot of that language is yours now, but I'll yield to you.
Yes, and Mr. Chairman, basically, if you look at the language carefully, what it is saying is that we ought to stick with really what's been the principle of Wyoming campaign finance law. And what we're really asking is to make sure that that law continues to be constitutional. Because we have historically limited corporations. We have historically allowed contributions from natural persons and simply required identification. And we aren't specifying in this the details of what a constitutional amendment ought to cover, just setting forth the principles. And Mr. Chairman, I get nervous about anything that might restrict First Amendment rights. And certainly the Citizens United case, which touched all this off, is aimed at protecting those First Amendment rights. But this amendment, this resolution, as it's now worded, essentially says that that decision goes maybe a step too far, and that there is some value in being able to trace back to which actual people are the source of the money, and that's what this is doing. So.
And Senator Scott, as I recall from the interwork, the key contribution that you made is on page 3, lines 7 through 9, that last sentence. The sentence that says if you identify yourself, your contributions wouldn't be restricted.
Yeah, and that is there. I think it's consistent with the First Amendment principles, Mr. Chairman. And we also, the draft resolution we had in the joint interim spoke of dark money, I think. And basically what this does is gets rid of that term and replace it by money that's not identified, can't be traced to a natural person.
Okay, thank you, Senator Scott. Would anybody in the audience like to address the committee on this bill? Is there anybody online that would like to talk to the committee about this bill? I kind of thought we'd have a big crowd. I think we're catching people asleep at the switch possibly, but. Does the Secretary of State's office have anything, Mr. Secretary? Okay. Well, committee, you've heard the testimony, which was none. Representative Western, you're not here to testify on Senate Joint Resolution 6, are you? Sure, I'm not. Okay. Thank you for coming. All right, committee, kind of an awkward moment. If you think we want to lay it back and get more testimony, or you just want to push ahead? Go ahead, Senator Boner.
Yeah, Mr. Chairman, I was always kind of skeptical of this resolution. It's been much improved since the interim. I still think it needs some work. Yeah, I think there's still kind of a bias against corporations without mentioning, say, unions in the same amount. So I think it's much better than it was, but it still needs some work. So I'll probably be a no today, but might be see an amendment from me later on if this gets to the floor.
Okay, thank you, Senator Boner. Senator Landon.
Mr. Chairman, thank you. I sure appreciate those comments. I've been actually a little bit surprised at how much I run into this issue out there on the streets in my community. A lot of people have come to me with this concern. They're just concerned. Especially given the campaign that we just completed, that campaign season was full of all kinds of things. And a lot of my constituents felt like they could not seem to find out where things were coming from. That's a concern, Mr. Chairman, and I know that maybe we'll take up the idea of pursuing that a little bit further here in the state of Wyoming, but this one at least I think it's a good start, and I'll support it to get it up on the floor. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator. Anybody else? Nobody jumped in wanting to comment because we didn't have any. Okay. Well, any amendments?
Mr. Chairman.
Got a motion by Scott. Any changes? Would you call the roll, please, Debbie?
Senator Barlow? Senator Boner?
No.
Senator Landon?
Aye.
Senator Scott?
Aye.
And Mr. Chairman?
Aye. Who would like to volunteer to carry this on the floor? Senator Scott's got it. And you fell into liquor, I'm afraid, Senator Barlow.
Fair trade, Mr. Chairman.
All right. So we're still looking for Senator Rothfuss to get here. He had some obligations this morning, so we will move on down. Do you think we could call up and see if Senator Hutchings is in the Senate chamber or possibly run up there? We're going to do her bill next, which is Senate File 86, Voter Identification Concealed Carry Permit. Thank you, Judy. Thanks a bunch. Are you on that, Bill? Oh, I promised Senator Rothfuss that I would wait for him to get here, and he promised he'd get here as soon as he can. So maybe we could text. Do you have his number? Yeah, text him.
I think he's meeting with the governor, Mr. Chairman, and also.
What comes first, Senator Landon? I mean, we have to. Tell him to get over here. We do have county clerks here, right? And Secretary of State, so we could start, and then when Senator Hutchings gets here, we're gonna give her the stage, okay? So let's talk about Senate File 86, Voter Identification Concealed Carry Permit. Mr. Secretary, you and your crew. Welcome, Mr. Secretary.
Oh, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Appreciate it. I'm Chuck Gray, a Wyoming Secretary of State. To my right is Joe Rubino, our Chief Policy Director and General Counsel. To the left is Jesse Naiman, our Chief Deputy. Today I stand in support of Senate File 86. Voter ID is an old friend, having worked on that, getting that through the legislature in 2021. And got a call, about 6 months after it passed, with member of the legislature that said, got a call from a constituent that we missed something that was a good acceptable form of ID, the concealed carry permit, and definitely agreed that this is a good addition. I do believe in one clarification that I've run by both Senator Hutchings and Representative Crago, who's running the House version of this bill, and would like to suggest an amendment that this be applied to a Wyoming concealed carry permit, which I believe would require a slight change in the bill. As written, Senate File 86 provides that a valid permit to carry a concealed firearm issued pursuant to WS 68104 will act as an acceptable identification. And you look at 68104 governing the punishment for carrying a concealed weapon and laying out the process for issuing a concealed carry permit. It provides an exception for both the permit issued by Wyoming under Wyoming Statute 68104 II, as well as a valid permit authorizing him to carry a concealed firearm authorized and issued by a governmental agency or entity in another state that recognizes Wyoming permits and is a valid statewide permit, unquote. Certainly reciprocity, that's fine. I'm very supportive of reciprocity, but I do believe that it should be a Wyoming concealed carry permit for purposes of voter identification. I think it's a pretty simple amendment, and I run it by both the House bringer of this bill and the Senate bringer. There's two versions floating, and I think they're identical.
Mr. Secretary, is it as simple as page 2, line 10, where it's the new language is a valid permit to carry? Is it as simple as saying a valid Wyoming permit to carry?
Mr. Chairman,
Or a valid
I'll ask Mr.
Wyoming
Rubin.
issued? I'm sorry, or perhaps a valid Wyoming issued permit to carry?
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'll turn this over to Mr. Rubino in a second. We were kicking around some amendments, opted to sort of, but I thought we would take out the statutory reference and just say Wyoming concealed carry permit, and then maybe say as issued and cite the statute. But I think Wyoming concealed carry permit is adequate. Mr. Rubino, I know we were kicking around some amendments. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, Mr. Chairman.
Rubino, go ahead. Well,
Mr.
I'm sorry,
Chairman.
Can we wait 1 second, Mr.
Yeah.
Rubino? We've got a question for Senator Scott.
Mr. Chairman, my suggestion, I'd like to try it on people, is that we insert on page 2, line 10, after a valid, insert the words Wyoming issued. So it would read a valid Wyoming issued permit, and then just continue the rest of the language. That's just my suggestion, is a simple way to do that.
Thank you, Senator Scott. We'll put that on for show here, and we'll go to Mr. Rubino. Mr. Rubino, welcome.
Mr. Chairman and Senator Scott, I think that is absolutely one route that you could go. I think there were two main ones that we were tossing around. One would be to insert Wyoming on page 2, line 10, between valid and permit. You could also, on page 2, line 11, instead of citing to Wyoming statute 68104 in a blanket fashion, you could insert Wyoming statute 68104 Romanet 2. And Romanet 2, just as a reminder, references the person possesses a permit under this section. Romanet 3, as a reminder, is the person holds a valid permit authorizing him to carry a concealed firearm authorized and issued by a governmental agency or entity in another state. And so those are two different avenues that you could do. One would be the Wyoming, and the other one would be a specific reference to Romanet 2.
Hang on, Senator Scott.
Mr. Chairman, why don't we do both?
Yeah, and I think we could eliminate one of the words of issued, just since, how about just a valid Wyoming permit to carry a concealed firearm issued? It's already in the language, pursuant to WS 68104 Romanet 2. We can think about that. What do you think, Mr. Rubino? Could that work?
Mr. Chairman, for clarification, you'd be deleting the word issued? Is that correct?
From the issued's already in the sentence, and so I don't think we need it twice. So after the word valid, just put the word Wyoming, And
Mr.
then-
Chairman, I understand.
And then the little Romanet 2 that you suggested. I think that's a good call. You guys
Yes,
okay?
Mr. Chairman.
All right. How about you? Back to you, Mr. Secretary. We good?
Yep, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Stand in support of the bill with that amendment. I think is a good clarifier.
Okay. Any more questions for the Secretary of State's office? Thanks for coming. You're hanging around because we are going to get to that blockchain bill. Back to people in the audience. When are you representing the clerks at all? You guys got a position? Oh, Ms. Langford was behind the pillar, and we're finding out from Judy that okay. We haven't heard from Senator Hutchings yet. What we may do is take all the public testimony here and just slide that bill over, go to the next thing that we've got people here for, and then, because I do want to give the senator a chance to testify, okay? Ms. Langford, welcome.
Good morning, Mr. Chairman and Senators. I'm Mary Langford, and I have the honor of representing the county clerks of Wyoming. I have with me this morning at the table the Honorable Glenn Bartlett, who is the Carbon County Clerk, and I have Hans Odie, who is the First Deputy in Park County. So we're really pleased to be able to be here. We'd like to let you know that we do support this piece of legislation. During the past election season, concealed carry permits were presented for voter ID at polling places for the purpose of voting. The application for a concealed carry permit is rigorous, and it is a Wyoming identification card with a photo ID. County clerks feel that it should be included in our acceptable forms of identification for purposes of voting. And then we'd like to address the proposed amendment by the Secretary of State as well.
Please go right ahead.
We would support the inclusion of Wyoming in that on line 10, yeah. The only thing that we do have a concern about is that the reference to 68104 is a peace officer reference. And maybe to have that checked to make sure if that's appropriate actually to be there. It's got a lot of other stuff in it besides talking about concealed carry weapons.
We'll look it up before we get too far.
So we'd appreciate it if you'd look at that, but
Yeah.
otherwise we're fine. And we're ready to stand for questions.
Questions for your county clerks? Questions for your county clerks? Thanks a bunch. Thank you. Good to see you all again.
Thank you. It's good to be
I
here.
think we're-
Thank you.
Mr. Chairman?
What's that?
And thank you for not bringing any maps.
Yeah, no maps. That's good. Yeah, I'm tired of maps. That's a reference to redistricting, everybody, and we spent a lot of time together. Anybody else in the audience like to testify on this bill? Anybody else? Is there anybody online that would like to testify? Okay, well, definitely want to give the sponsor a chance to address us about this bill, so if we could just slide it over. Mr. Chairman. Senator Landon?
There's a reference to the photo on this concealed carry permit, and I was looking down at the chairman of transportation. I bet the photo is probably better quality than your driver's license. What do you think?
Well, if it's black and white, it would be. I don't know if they use the same contractors, why not?
And just before we close this out, remember one thing, everybody. The identification purposes for voting, when you go to the poll, if you're already a registered voter, that identification's purpose is to confirm that you are the registered voter. When you actually register to vote, it's a little bit different. It's a more rigorous identification required. So I just point that out. It's kind of a two-step process, and a lot of people don't know that. All right, well, I've tried to put it off, but I guess we're to Senate File 40, which is Federal Political Action Committee reports. This is a bill that came through the interim. As you all recall, we became aware late in the election process of the existence of a federally registered PAC that was making expenditures in Wyoming elections. And if memory serves me well, it was up in the north central part of the state, pretty close to where you're home, Senator Barlow. And the issue was, I think there was some back and forth between the Secretary of State's office at the time, and I don't know the extent of it, but it was determined that because it was a federal PAC, and we didn't have jurisdiction to make them file in Wyoming. Or that's not the right word, but they didn't file in Wyoming, yet they were working Wyoming elections. And this bill changes the law to say that if you're a federally registered PAC, but you are participating in a Wyoming election or like a ballot issue, that you will comply with Wyoming law. And so I think if you recall, the circumstances of that situation was that the filings at the federal level weren't useful for the Wyoming election cycle. I believe they were delayed on making a filing. There may be a filing they didn't even make, but the federal deadlines and things didn't follow the Wyoming deadlines, of course, and that information proved to be inadequate or not available, or perhaps deliberately not supplied. With that, that's the bill. This was a committee bill. All I did was gather signatures from, this was not a committee bill, but it was discussed in committee, and it was late in the time we didn't have another meeting to look at a draft. So what I did was gather up the co-sponsorship of members that were remaining on the committee. So that's where we got the names here. So with that, any questions for me? Is there any, Senator Landon?
So, Mr. Chairman, thank you. Sorry to slow it down here, but
We need a little slowing because we don't got any sponsors.
I'm just trying to get arms around what we're trying to do here. I guess if a political action committee, a federal political action committee, has contributed to the campaign of one of our congressional candidates, this bill says that they don't have to report here in Wyoming.
That's correct.
I'm wondering if that's a good thing. I wonder why we would not want to know. Is it more a case that we cannot require them to do that, Mr. Chairman, or is it that we're okay that we don't want to know the information?
Well, let's go back to the old language and just kind of start there. This is a carve out for federal issues that's in the law already. It says candidates for federal office, campaign committees for candidates for federal office, and federal political action committees shall not be required to file contribution expenditure reports under this section if the candidate or the committee is required to comply with federal election law reporting requirements. That's the exact Wyoming law that we have right now. And so this reaches out again and says, this is true as long as you're making contributions only to federal candidates or for federal issues. But if you have that federal report and you stray into state issues, then you are required. So it carves out an exception to the exception, if you will, I think is the way the structure is.
Thank you. Thank you. Appreciate that.
Who's next? Senator Barlow.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So this issue did come up in my community, and actually another one that I'm now aware of. And I think that the intent of the current language is that that you don't have a requirement if it's only within a federal PAC. But the way it works practically is the first two, candidate for federal office, well, that's only one election. Candidate or campaign committees for candidates, well, that's still tied to one election. But a political action committee can have multiple candidates within it. And so I think there just needs to be an extension of that singularity of the federal office only transferred to this, and that's what the amendment does. And so I believe, I believe the intent at the time when it was passed, which maybe Senator Scott remembers, was that if you're only federal office, that's what it is. But now we have these other mechanisms, including political action committees, that have vast interests and often are on both sides, federal, state, local, even precinct in the case of this one. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I mean, i.e. political party elections. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator Barlow. So committee, everybody remembers that. Let's see if anybody wants to address us about this. Mr. Secretary, you guys got anything on this? You're good to go. Is there anybody online? Mr. Meyer, welcome, come on up.
Good morning, Scott Meyer on behalf of the Wyoming Bankers Association. In Wyoming, we have a bank pack, and we restrict everything to just Wyoming candidates at the state level. We are affiliated with a national pack to which we contribute to, and that they have typically only dealt with national candidates, federal candidates. So our congressional delegation would be somebody that they would look at to make those contributions. Given the changes that we've seen a lot with, and I see my good friend Representative Western behind me, but dealing with our speedy banks and some of the other issues going on with banking, I think that there's been some suggestion that maybe the federal PAC get involved in some of the Wyoming banking issues. We have refrained from doing that, but it would seem to me, and I have not read this bill, I've just been here waiting for digital assets to come up, but hearing what you have to say, it sounds to me like that would be something that if the national PAC wanted to get involved in this, then they would be subject to Wyoming law. And I would tell you that I would support that. I think that is something that, in full disclosure and transparency, that is something that they need to do.
Thank you, Mr. Meyer. Questions from Mr. Meyer? Thank you. Anybody else wish to address the committee? Okay, and nothing came in online. All right, committee, I think you've heard the bill. What is your pleasure?
Move the bill.
Got a
Do
motion,
pass.
motion by Barlow, discussion. Senator Landon.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just a couple more thoughts in all of what we've been talking about this morning. I actually hope there's a day that we can do better. I think there's a lot of things going on out there that our constituents can't find out about and can't really can't tell where it's coming from and where the money's coming from. And I know there's always going to be these restrictions and hurdles and whatever, but I hope we'll stay diligent there and revisit this often. I'd like to have a clear and complete picture of, even at the congressional level, of who helped on what campaign. So this doesn't do this, but I like the bill. I think it's a good restriction. So thank you.
Okay, thank you, Senator Landon. Anyone else? Are there any proposed amendments? Not seeing any. Debbie, call the roll, please.
Senator Barlow?
Aye.
Senator Boner?
Aye.
Senator Landon?
Aye.
Senator Scott?
Aye.
Mr. Chairman?
Aye. So unanimous aye. Thank you very much. So we've got the deal where we've got one bill where we got one guy here, and we still have the concealed carry ID bill, and we're going to wait for Senator Hutchings. So, Mr. Western, could you start us off on that? And do you have any idea if Senator Rothfuss is, or tell me what you'd like to do. We could take a 10-minute break. We could easily do that.
Mr. Chairman, I believe Senator Rothfuss specifically requested that. So if we could take a break, that would be.
Okay. Let's take a break till 10 minutes after the hour. Is that okay? Just stretch your legs. So it'd be 8:10, we'll come back. Go find somebody. Yes.
On the concealed carry permit, the reference was 68104 II. That's not a complete reference. There's multiple A, B, and C sections, and I can't trace that one back in the statutes.
A.
It's A.
So it's Rubino, right? Mr. Rubino? What's his name?
Yes.
Mr. Rubino? Yeah, so I'll tell you what, we can still fix all that. So if you double check, we can add the A. We're the committee that'll fix it.
And Mr. Chairman, A doesn't fit very well.
Okay, Senator Scott's put you on notice. A doesn't fit very well, so you guys cook that around. We're still taking 10-minute break. You don't, it doesn't realize it, but I'm gonna walk down the hall anyway. All right, everybody, we're going to, we of course have two bills on our plate, and they are left open bills of, from where we were working earlier. One was the concealed carry ID, and we're waiting for Senator Hutchins then, but we've also had some back and forth during the break about that. So we want to bring folks up to speed that we don't think that statutory reference to the concealed carry permit is quite captures it. And so we're looking for a, maybe making it more generic. So Senator Landon, you've been working on that, right? And then you and Senator Scott maybe can tell us where we're at.
So, Mr. Chairman, thank you. You'll remember on page 2 is where we had adopted the amendment or talked about the language on line 10 and 11 in visiting with our county clerks and with the secretary. We've got language that we would propose right there. And the paragraph X would simply read, a valid permit issued by the state of Wyoming to carry a concealed firearm. Eliminating the reference to the statute, my concern there would just simply be that statutes change. That would necessitate us coming back in. We don't want to invalidate at any time going into an election year, and then we discover that the statute has changed or whatever. I think it's simpler, cleaner. So that would be the amendment that I would propose when the time comes.
And just for folks online, we're not operating super formally now, but this is going to be a replacement to what we discussed before the break. So I looked to the Secretary of State's office, who was very helpful on this, and Mr. Rubino, he was helpful. We're good with kind of the language that Senator Landon's talking about. And then I looked to the clerks, and we're good with that. Take out the reference to the actual statute and make it more generic. So with that, we had passed that amendment earlier on this bill. So we could go through a formal reconsideration, all sorts of things, but I think we can operate informally and just say we're backing away from that amendment, Debbie, and we're going to have a replacement here, and the replacement is going to be as Senator Landon is going to give you.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just to reiterate, paragraph X on line 10 would read as follows. On to line 11, a valid permit issued by the state of Wyoming to carry a concealed firearm, period.
Yeah.
And strike the remainder of line 11.
Mr. Chairman.
Senator Scott.
I move we replace the previous amendment with the one Senator Landon.
That's a good way to handle this. So Senator Landon, would you read it one more time?
One more time, maybe just beginning on line 10, a valid permit issued by the state of Wyoming to carry a concealed firearm, period, striking the rest of line 11.
So
Okay.
that would be the entirety of Romanet 10 now. That was just that language. Got it? Good? Okay. Everybody understand? People in the audience understand? And Senator Scott has helped us with the motion. We're going to pass this and replace the previously thing. So all those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
This chair's an aye. Any opposed? Unanimous aye. So that replaces it. We're back on the bill. We've got a motion on the bill. Let's just call the roll on the bill.
Senator Barlow? Aye. Senator Boner?
Aye.
Senator Landon?
Aye.
Senator Scott?
Aye.
Mr. Chairman.
Aye. Thank you very much. That's 5 ayes on the bill. Good work. Thanks to everybody that worked on that. Thank the co-sponsor or the prime sponsor too, but we're going to move on. Could we go to the only bill left on our deal is the digital assets. What's it actually called? Wyoming Digital Asset Registration Act. Does the Secretary of State have any opening comments on this? We'll just hear from you. Especially since you're the only dog and the big dog in the room. So please, we'd love to hear from you.
Yeah, I think we'd like to go. We do have a meeting tomorrow, so it'd be good.
You bet. We'll work with you.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Again, for the record, I'm Chuck Gray, the Wyoming Secretary of State. And to my right is our Chief Deputy, Jesse Naiman, and to the left is our General Counsel, Chief Policy Director, Joe Rubino. In terms of Senate File 76, to implement it, a new module would need to be created to allow for the registration, renewal, and cancellation of a digital asset. The bill also requires that the registrar of the digital asset, if a business entity, be domiciled in Wyoming. That references page 5, lines 5 through 6. And additional online search functionality must be implemented to validate this requirement. That is a large part of the fiscal note, putting that search functionality in there. We had a meeting with our tech division on that. That was a large part of that fiscal cost. Senate File 76 would require the Secretary of State's office to create also a new module to allow for the registration, renewal, and cancellation. The bill also requires a public list of all digital assets registered. The bill as written also requires the Secretary of State's office provide the registrant with the cryptographically signed certificate of registration, which would be entirely unique to our processes. There are 2 costs associated with providing this type of certificate. The office would need to contract with a vendor for automated digital document signing certificate services to be utilized through an API. The exact cost of this service is unknown at this time, as the cost is variable depending on volume, but it would become an ongoing operational cost demanded if this bill were to become statute. The initial estimate of $248,400, which was provided by my predecessor on December 5th of last year, did not include the likely $18,000 cost to modify the WyoSuite business module. We have since revised the fiscal impact to account for this cost and resubmitted this to account for the $18,120 cost there. The bill contains no appropriation, and I do think that I would ask the committee to please clarify this. I've talked with Senator Rothfuss about that. At the very least, I know he's kicked around some language of allowing us to revert back the amount from our business filing fees that this costs. That's a possibility. I would also ask, and I want to respect Senator Rothfuss here. I know he's very passionate about this, but what is the intention here? I mean, I know they're very passionate about moving to this API system on all of our filings, and that I would really caution on. I don't want to be an obstructionist, but I can tell you my predecessors in our transition meetings and our tech division and our division heads have been very clear that there are problems with this. And so if this is sort of a plant the flag approach where, we're going to be setting up this API and then coming back a year later and saying, okay, it works, let's do it on all our business filings, I really want to caution on that and do that in advance. If it's totally a separate process, as I understand the current bill to be written, I think we're okay with that. I do want to bring out there, I'm not sure there's going to be the return on this, $250,000 cost. I'm skeptical on that. Just for a little history here, and this really goes back to our transition meetings with Ms. Wheeler. I mean, the DAOs probably have paid for itself. And the Series LLC, there's more of a debate there on that one. But in terms of it being a bonanza, it has not been there. I certainly understand the argument that once all these pieces are in place, then it's going to be a bonanza. But just want to give the history on this because each time there is a certain argument that this next thing is going to be a bonanza. So it is important to go back on the history here. We did prepare an amendment to eliminate on the word cryptographic. We believe that one word change would eliminate the API registration element. We did prepare that amendment. It's very short. We can pass that around if you want. Mr. Rubino, if we could just give that to the LSO, and then we filled out all their paperwork. It's very short. It's just, he has the reference there. That would remove the API part of this. It doesn't reduce the cost that much because actually the Page 5, lines 5 through 6 reference, linking it to a domiciled business in Wyoming. That search functionality is what is actually creating a large part of the cost. But this would eliminate that API designation. I know there's going to be pushback from the blockchain folks, Senator Rothfuss and Representative Western. Certainly respect their work on this. We met with Senator Rothfuss and then had a few more conversations with our tech folks. Certainly want to respect his work, but it's an option for the committee to delete that cryptographic functionality. I think that's all our comments.
Okay, I'm going to take a slight time out and give some stage direction. Representative Chestek, your bill's come and gone. I know that it's got to keep your eye on the Corporations Committee. We don't care about him. We're the Corporations Committee. But I do point out the bill passed with no amendments. So put a smile on your face. We took care of it. All right, thank you. All right, back to questions for Mr. Secretary. Go ahead, Senator Scott.
Mr. Chairman, I was unclear on the potential cost of implementing this. What was that total figure that you estimate?
So we have a corrected copy fiscal note, and it talks about contractual service costs increase of $266,520. That seems to be, and that includes, as I understand from the previous fiscal note, an $18,000 increase. Would that be correct, Mr. Secretary?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Yes, it includes that integration cost. And no matter what, we're going to have to, there were two options for integration. One was 40 grand, one was 18 grand. We chose the cheaper one. It's unclear to us why they didn't put that in the fiscal note, because you're going to have to integrate it no matter what. So that's why we did that correction.
But it is in this corrected?
Yes.
Okay, perfect. So, there's no appropriations in the bill. I recall there's another bill moving we had the other day, maybe it was in judiciary, where it was that court bill. It didn't have an appropriation, but the Appropriations Committee had already provided for that in the budget, we understand.
That is correct.
Yeah.
That is correct.
So, you're like,
Mr. Chairman?
go ahead.
Mr. Chairman, I do have a question just for clarification regarding the fiscal note. So, Mr. Secretary, is that a biennial cost? Is that a
one-time?
It's a one-time cost? Just trying to make sure that I've got my arms around it. Any ongoing?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I think my comments were a little bit, but it was kind of buried. Thanks for that question. That is a one-time cost, is our understanding, but then there will be an ongoing cost that is unknown at this time. We're going to engage more with our software provider on this now that it's kicking gears. I asked the tech division to do that. They had done an initial. They're careful due to the confidentiality rules on these bills, not to engage in a formal negotiation or even an informal negotiation before it's filed. Now that it's been filed, we feel more comfortable doing that. So we'll have a little more of an idea on the ongoing cost.
Yeah,
very soon.
In other words, this could get real. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And so let's talk about it. What are we looking at so that as it goes through the process, as you get asked, you'll know a little bit more. Yeah. Thank you, Mr. Secretary.
Thank you.
Any other questions for the Secretary of State? Senator Barlow? Then we'll go to you, Senator Scott.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So effective dates are always interesting to me when I look at rulemaking requirements, et cetera. So, and this, I think, obligates some rulemaking, necessary rulemaking. So this looks like rules, the way that Section 3 is, necessary to implement by October 1, 2023. And it's my experience that rules often take quite a bit of time. And maybe with this, a new type of a process. If this bill advances, would you like a potentially later effective date for the actual bill to come into effect? You still get rulemaking authority now, but do you think it can be completed in the time that this bill anticipates, which to me looks like if it gets signed in September, 6 months, which is a pretty fast turnaround in rules and state government. But thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator. Mr. Secretary, any thoughts on that?
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I would like it would be good to have a little bit of breathing room. Got quite a bit into a conversation with our tech division. The original had it at July 1. They were very nervous about, we couldn't do that. I asked them, well, on the new October 1, how many days buffer do we have? We didn't have it, partially because we didn't engage in a negotiation yet. Even informally, I would like a little bit of a buffer, a little more. Thank you.
Okay. Anything else for the Secretary of State's office?
Yes,
Senator Scott, I forgot about you. Go ahead.
Mr. Chairman, it seems to me on the cost of the thing, we've got a couple of choices. I suspect, unfortunately, the costs are probably real. We could put an appropriation in the bill and then send it, then we'd have to send it to the Appropriations Committee. We could just re-refer it to the Appropriations Committee on the floor and tell them informally, we think it needs an appropriation, and let them hash it out with the Secretary of State. And they know the ins and outs of the budgeting and more experience than we do on this sort of thing. That might be my recommendation, Mr. Chairman, rather than put an appropriation that may then get corrected. But those, Mr. Chairman, those are the options I see, and I'd like to know what the Secretary of State thinks and what the sponsors of the bill think ultimately.
Fair enough. I think Senator Scott's inclination is to re-refer to appropriations, but not put a specific appropriations in it. Let them kind of deal with that. And in our motion to re-refer, we could let them add an appropriation, of course. So what do you think about that?
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I think that's a fine approach, and we can have more conversations. I've ruminated a lot on Senator Rothfuss's approach of allowing us to revert or putting a specific number. I have a slight preference for a specific number, I think, because then it's clear on the legislature's intent. But I could be convinced out of it, because if it's wrong, then if our estimate's a little bit off, but I have a slight preference towards the clear direction.
Okay.
But letting appropriations work that out, I'm okay with that.
All right, thank you, Mr. Secretary. Any other questions for the Secretary of State's office? I think we're good. We have your proposed amendment, page 2, line 21. We will take that up appropriately at the right time, okay? You can count on us. All right, have a good day.
All right, thank you.
Representative Western, we are down to you. We're okay, yeah. If some concerns arise, get back to Senator Rothfuss, get back to the committee, and you can review what we do here the rest of the day. So thank you. Have a great day. We are going to get Western now. The whole world, everybody's abandoned you, and here you are.
Mr. Chairman, I feel like what's that moment in high noon when these gunfight's about to start, I was the only guy in the street.
Representative Western, can you help us with Senate File 76?
Absolutely. I know we had kind of started to get into it at the previous meeting. I will admit that this was Senator Rothfuss, his baby in the blockchain task force, so it was kind of his point person, but I will certainly do my best. I'll try to keep my comments brief, but really at a high level, the concept is to try to get ahead of the curve. I mean, in the simplest terms, this conceptually has existed in Wyoming since statehood, where if I own this piece of property, my ownership of it is recorded in the county clerk and recorder's office and all that kind of stuff. So that's kind of the most basic analogy here, where we are in and are advancing in a world where these digital assets, Bitcoin, other types of cryptocurrencies, NFTs that I'm sure you all have heard about, certainly over the last couple of years, are digital assets. And I think the idea is for us, as a state, like how we were very innovative with the our LLC Act in, I think it was 1973. You know, at the time, there were some folks I know who doubted it, but in reality, it turned out to be a really smart, innovative idea that I think placed us in a really good position. That's kind of the similar thought process with this type of bill, and it allows us, where obviously instead of a county clerk and recorder would be the Secretary of State to act as that clerk of those types of records. So that's kind of the broad level of why this bill is here, and certainly what we are trying to achieve. We've talked with folks, you know, from that kind of digital asset, crypto world, blockchain world, who, if I recall correctly, we did receive testimony saying these types of functions are needed. Certainly from, you know, there's the custodians that are private companies, but certainly that public entity as well, such as the Secretary of State, can have a really vital role in that process. So that's at a high level, Mr. Chairman, what's going on here. And so if you have any questions, I will do my best to answer them.
Okay. Everybody, questions for the representative? Maybe we could all just kind of stumble through the bill together.
Absolutely.
We'll let you lead us, and it's okay if you weren't prepared to do this, but let's just.
No, absolutely.
Thank you.
So obviously, we've got, you know, page 1, enabling clause, the preamble. I think we start getting into some of the definitions and the registered digital assets on page 2. The lawful owner of any digital asset or other lawful owner's agent, usually generally an attorney in this case, may register the digital asset with a secretary in accordance with this article. So we're just kind of saying that, hey, that you have to, that either your registered agent or your attorney, and then you also, if you keep going, you have to be a resident of the state of Wyoming to apply to have the secretary title these assets. You know, I think a really important part is right there at the top of page 3, where it says nothing in this article shall be construed to confer any ownership, property, or other rights related to the digital assets beyond those specifically granted in this article. So we're just simply saying, hey, you are who you say you are, you own this asset, we're not giving any, a transfer of ownership.
We're going to have back and forth as we go along. If that's
Absolutely.
okay. Senator Barlow.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So one of the things that struck me was, and I appreciate you highlighting the language, Romanet C on line 3 is, Romanet A says a lawful owner may. So what happens if, I mean, how are we understanding who the lawful owner is? Because it's improperly registered if they're not the lawful owner. So what recourse is there both for the state and for potentially the lawful owner under this act? Because it seems to me that they're almost, I just want to understand that. And maybe it's very clear in other law, I just don't understand it, Mr. Chairman. Thank you.
And before you reply, Representative, it could be that that's not really the state's job, but that's the assertion that the registrants are making. Then someone that challenges that registration, they might challenge on that point. But, you know, I'm not sure that we're the fact checker here, but I will yield to Representative Western.
Mr. Chairman, I was about to say Representative Barlow, my apologies. Senator Barlow.
We call him freshman.
Mr. Chairman, so that's a really good point. And so it's kind of at the bottom of the bill, it does go on to say that they have to submit a legal attestation saying they are who they say they are, that they meet the requirements, that they're a Wyoming resident, or that if it's registered to a company or LLC, that they are domiciled in Wyoming. And at the bottom of I think in one of the last couple of pages, that these disputes are handled by the Wyoming Chancery Court. Again, to kind of maybe give more context, the type of assets we're talking about, most of them are stored on these blockchains. The way these blockchains work, certainly if it's a blockchain that's acting as a custodian or as a registry for, let's say NFTs, kind of just by virtue of the technology and how it works, they're going to be able to see, okay, person A is claiming that they own this asset, but if we look at the blockchain records, it's actually person B, and the code can clearly tell us that. So and then of course they can go to the Chancery Court and say, based off this evidence, based off this code, what person A is claiming is in fact not true because the code in the blockchain clearly tells us so. But yeah, for those disputes, obviously
I think Chairman Case makes a really good point that it's not necessarily the states. They're just saying, they came to us, they signed this, this legal attestation saying they are who they say they are, and this is their asset. Obviously, that can be provided to the courts during discovery in any kind of legal, civil litigation.
Representative Western, would you mind if we put a timeout for you just for 1 second?
Absolutely.
Senator Hutchings, we passed your bill. We kept it open and we were looking, and we did, there was a small amendment, and it was brought mostly by the Secretary of State's office, and it was to make it a Wyoming permit as a. Did you say no? We just start, it was a good guess. I didn't know how long liquor would take, but we finished the liquor bills promptly, and we've finished all our other bills, and we did keep you open, but we're moving.
Do you want to know why we wanted it, or because I just
We look forward to that. You know what? We appreciate you doing it, and we heard a little bit of the backstory, and you will be running the bill on the floor, and you can say why you wanted it. And we're grateful for your work, and everybody thought it was good. There wasn't a single person to testify against it.
All right, I appreciate you. I don't know if this has ever happened before, but I thank God for you.
It actually happens often in here, but thank you. We're with you. All right. Representative Western, back to you.
I think Senator Barlow did that, or Mr. Chairman, Senator Barlow did that. Okay.
We're good on that. Anybody else? We'll just keep going, okay?
Absolutely. So you can see in 3429-203, this kind of talks about the application, what has to be contained with it, the filing fees, et cetera. I know our good Secretary of State is not here, but we all know he's quite concerned about the fiscal matters, and as with other programs, the filing fees are there and assessed to pay for the program and for its administration. As you can see, the person applying, they have to put their name, their address, all that kind of stuff. The other nature of the digital asset, is it Bitcoin? Is it Cardano? Is it an NFT or an asset of that nature? If we kind of keep going on through page, says right there on line 17 on page 4, talks about the registration fee shall not exceed $300. Continuing on page 5, it talks a little bit about the applicant. Again, if it's an individual applying for a registration, they have to be a resident of the state of Wyoming, or if they are trying to register it to their corporation, that has to be domiciled as well.
Can I interrupt you here? We'll go with Senator Landon first.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. You certainly could have jumped in there. I'm trying to get my arms around this domiciled in Wyoming and what the advantage is for someone to have to live here and then register with the Secretary of State. Can you help me with that, Representative? What's the impetus behind you have to live here, and so then you got to be domiciled here, and so you're going to register. Is that in an effort to have more of these entities come here?
Representative Western.
Mr. Chairman, Senator, certainly a big part of that was to kind of put a safeguard in place. As we all know, certainly with LLCs, whether it's Wyoming, Delaware, some of these other states, the vast majority of business being conducted by folks is in good faith and totally legitimate and legal. There are some actors, of course, who might not have less than scrupulous intent. And so that was kind of part of the reason, was just kind of a break check, saying to avoid some of those applicants, certainly some of the ones from overseas where some of these, a lot of malfeasance does go on, is to say, we're just going to put a couple of sideboards on here to make sure that the people who are using this program or using this service is, that they're legit. And we have some of these kind of break checks to make sure it's not just people from across the world. So,
thank you.
Or they're registered agents as well.
Let's go to Senator Scott now. Senator Scott?
Mr. Chairman, on that same issue of the firm has to be domiciled here in the state of Wyoming. Now, the people that own the firm obviously can live elsewhere and domicile the firm here. Are we going to have trouble with this as a restraint of interstate commerce. What does domiciling it in Wyoming do for us that just having a registered agent and being properly registered to do business in the state doesn't do?
We got a tag on here, so we'll give you time to think
Yeah,
about it.
and Mr. Chairman, and I'd actually like to tag on to that, because in section A on page 2, these digital assets are deemed to be located in Wyoming as well. So we have two components of this, not just that the entity or the person currently in the draft is domiciled or resident. We also are saying that the asset is now deemed to be located in the state, within the state of Wyoming for purposes of law. So anyway, there's two things. It gives us complete jurisdiction, but I think that goes to the Commerce Clause issue as well, potentially.
Senator Scott?
And Mr. Chairman, I can see that maybe as potentially justifying this domicile in Wyoming, because one of the advantages here is these things can be anywhere, and this gives it a firm home and makes it clear which laws apply. So that may be, those two may be tied together. I don't understand fully what's going on here.
Thank you.
I suspect that's it. Got a lot of mics on, so the cameras have a hard time focusing on me with all these mics on. No, I didn't mean it that way. I'm turning mine off. Go back to you. Representative.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Senator Scott, I'm not going to pretend to be an expert on the Commerce Clause, and obviously there's a ton of case law there. But again, a lot of it does come down to just having those safeguards. Again, they're not a resident, they have an LLC that's domiciled here where they have to have an operating agreement for that LLC filed with the Secretary of State, to have some of those kind of measures, just to make sure that we're dealing with folks who are legit and come in good faith and goodwill, and trying to weed out potential actors that might be less than scrupulous. So I wish my Senator
Don't worry,
Rothfuss was here, because
he will walk in and we will.
save the day.
I don't know about that. He might try to start over, but Representative Western, I kind of following along on this. I realize there's a fee for registration of these digital assets, okay? It could be up to $300 according to the page for the bill. But these are combined with an LLC, most likely, right? I mean, and then the LLC would pay an annual fee. And so that is the sliding scale fee. And so if they're paying the annual fee, then they're paying the annual fee on the value of the digital assets that are considered domiciled in Wyoming. Would that be true?
Mr. Chairman, clarification, for the renewal of the LLC, is that?
Yes.
Okay. Mr. Chairman, yes, that would be correct.
That would be potentially some good money for the state of Wyoming. So, all right, well, why don't you keep going? Let's keep plunging through this bill.
Sure, absolutely. Continuing on page 5, kind of talks about the examination of the application and that the amendment process. The Secretary of State has the ability to go back to the applicant should they need further information to be provided. Top of page 6 talks about they may revise the application with the agreement of the applicant, or may require the applicant to submit a revised application. Again, sometimes they may go back to the applicant and say, hey, we need more information, we need clarity on this. And of course, I think an important component on page 6, line 14, 15, the Secretary has the ability to refuse a digital asset. And also, it kind of goes through the process as well if they want to deregister the asset. If the applicant is found not to meet the registration requirements, the Secretary shall advise the applicant of their reasons. The applicant shall have a reasonable period of time specified by the Secretary which to apply or amend the application for reexamination. And then, of course, page 6 and going on to page 7 talks about the renewals every 5 years, and then it talks about same kind of thing. The renewal fee shall not exceed $150. Keeps going on. The public record of digital assets, like are similar to our county clerk and recorders for real property. These are also public records as well. So, or is there?
I believe Senator Barlow has a question.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So I appreciate this paragraph A on top of page 7 strikes me as, I don't know why we would need a renewal. If it's a digital asset, it seems like it's kind of like a corporation. It's indeterminable in life. But what strikes me is, how do you actually change the registration? How do you transfer the registration to somebody else? How do you sell the asset if it has this value? How do you, and maybe it's later on, but I see renewal and I see cancellation, but I don't see actually how to convey within this context of what we're doing here. Because if we're talking about an asset, you would want to be able to dispose of it at some point. You don't just sit it there for no reason. It creates value. At some point, you'd want to realize that value. So maybe it's elsewhere, and if it is, I apologize, but it seems you'd have to cancel it, and then someone else would have to register it. How about we just have a transfer? Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Representative Western, if you can.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. There's nothing explicit in the bill, but also that the Secretary does have the rulemaking authority for promulgating rules on that process in the event of a transfer. And here's my dear friend and colleague, Senator Rothfuss, to help with that one.
Senator Rothfuss, we're all done with this bill. So.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Appreciate your time.
Why don't you guys confer for a minute and tell them where you're at, just offline.
Does anybody want coffee or promulgation?
I'm good, thanks. So,
Yeah, Mr.
welcome, Senator Rothfuss.
Thank you. My apologies for.
No, just, we had a long agenda today, and we're trying to find stuff where people were here, and we got ahead of the people that were arriving at the Capitol, basically. So,
Understood.
but this is our only bill left. It's your bill from the Blockchain Task Force. We have gone through it, and Representative Western has done a great job of getting us this far in. We had testimony from the Secretary of State's office earlier. They had to leave for another meeting. They have a small proposed amendment to remove the word cryptographically, and that's on page 2, I believe, the bottom of the page. They also discussed the fiscal note, and they referred to their corrected copy of the fiscal note.
Yeah.
We debated about whether to add an appropriation or to send it to appropriations. So I think we came out that we're kind of thinking of sending it to appropriations. I think they weren't opposed to the bill, but they weren't as excited as I think you are.
Yeah, Mr.
And,
Chairman, that's accurate. And Mr.
Is your
Chairman,
mic on?
I
Just making sure. Green light?
Yep.
Okay.
I'm sorry, I might not be close enough. Mr. Chairman, I had an amendment drafted for the appropriation based on the original fiscal note, which was at 250,000. The updated is at 270,000, which is obviously not a Herculean challenge to fix, but it's not reflected in this draft. So
Okay.
if you do choose to do that, there's an available draft for you, which again, if it goes to appropriations, is fine too.
We'll discuss that. And Senator Rothfuss, the instant you walked in, we were talking about the fees, and we had talked about the up to $300 registration fee. Then we got Representative Western and led us to the renewal fee after 5 years, up to $150. Senator Barlow had asked a question about, why do you even renew these? Don't they just exist forever? And then the question arose about transferring and how does that occur? And you walked in.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The transfer is an interesting question that I don't think we discussed in committee, but at the same time, this language is mirrored off of trademark language in terms of kind of the ownership and the way that I believe with trademarks in Wyoming, actually, I do believe you have to renew the registration of them as well. As far as the transferability, though, this is effectively it's a property asset where when you're making the registration, you're saying, I own the property asset at that moment. If you were to sell the asset or sell the entity that owned the asset, so an LLC, the asset ownership would transfer, and what you would probably need to do at that point in time is re-register it if you wanted it registered under your name, which would again be appropriate based on an attestation that you own it at that time under the way this is structured.
And the reason it's structured that way is that there will not be continuous monitoring of ownership, right? Nobody's going to come and be the ownership police. So it's an instantaneous attestation when you register it that you are the owner at that moment. And at that point in time, it's true. What happens between then and the next time somebody stamps it that way, the Secretary of State's office is not going to police, and that's intentional because it would take a lot of work to do that.
Okay, Senator Scott.
Mr. Chairman, and I think Senator Barlow has asked a fundamental question here in the transfer. And I think it turns on what is the purpose of this bill? What is the value that the registration confers on the people that are doing the registering, such they want to register it? And if we understand that, then I think we can understand the issues around transfer of ownership better.
Absolutely. Mr. Chairman?
Back to you, Senator
Senators.
Rothfuss.
The key at this point in time to the value of a registration is having the asset, which is again digital and therefore, out in the ether someplace, for purposes of regulation and legal standing. It would be domiciled in Wyoming. It would be an asset that was definitively in Wyoming, which means you then have access to our Chancery Court, which is expressly provided, but you also have the clarity of the statutes that we've been working on for the past 5 years to provide how digital assets are treated as property, how they're respected in the courts, how smart contracts are authoritative, everything else that goes with it. So there's no question of jurisdiction. That's a key. The other is, right now in the digital asset space, there is a lot of dialogue about what are called non-fungible tokens, but it's basically a class of digital assets that has a lot of question marks about what are these, are they owned, who owns them, how do you know they're owned? There's no good way to know that in any other state. But if we had a registration authority that was cryptographically signed, you would have the capacity to have a legal event that was triggered with a date that says, as of this date, an individual attested to owning this digital asset in the eyes of the state of Wyoming, which is important and would provide a lot of clarity that folks that are fighting over digital assets, who owns this? Does it have standing? Do I own it? Is this AI-produced art owned at all? Can it be registered? How would it be handled by courts? That clarity doesn't exist in other states, Mr. Chairman. It does exist in Wyoming. And so if you have an entity that is operating in a state on the East Coast, what they would do is establish an LLC in Wyoming. You'll recall from, I'm sure, what the good representative discussed, that you need to be either an individual person in Wyoming or a corporate structure in Wyoming domiciled here to have access to this. And I don't know if we talked about why that's the case, but we went through that pretty extensively. You'd set up that LLC in Wyoming, and it would then have ownership rights to those assets and have then all of the benefits of being a Wyoming entity with regard to digital assets, and we think there would be many. Worst possible outcome, nobody agrees and nobody does it, realistically. But there's a lot of interest in this. And there are billions and billions of dollars of digital assets out there that don't have a lot of legal standing.
Anybody else? Did you withdraw? Senator Scott.
Chairman, it would seem to me that from what I'm hearing, a good part of the advantage is a public declaration that this is owned by somebody. And that I would think if they sell the whole LLC, then the LLC still owns it. I don't see any need for a change in the registration. But if they sell the asset while retaining the LLC, and they sell it to somebody else, it would seem to me there has to be a provision for the transfer of that. And the public record would then show who does own the asset. And Mr. Chairman, I would think that would make this advantageous. Otherwise, I would think we would be open to facilitating a fraud where somebody registers something, promptly sells it, and it appears from the Wyoming records that they still own it. And Mr. Chairman, I would think it would have to have a provision saying, if you sell it, you have to transfer it. I don't know how the cryptographic stuff works. Maybe that could be explained. And do you have to have a different cryptographic signature or something? And there probably needs to be a fee for doing that.
Senator Rothfuss?
So the original draft, actually, I said a few minutes ago that we didn't discuss this, and now that I've had time to reflect exactly on what Senator Scott was saying, that scenario, I recall that we did discuss it and that the original draft had a transfer in it, and that we took it out and settled for the language that's provided by you can cancel it and then you can redeclare. And that for a digital asset, that would be the proper way to do it for exactly the reasons you said, Senator Scott, is that there needs to be a transaction. If it's truly owned by someone else, there would be a cryptographic transfer of the ownership that's authoritative. What should happen at that point in time is they should point to it and re-register it. They wouldn't even necessarily need to cancel it, although that would cause confusion. I think we've got like a $30 cancellation fee. But the attestation at the moment when somebody's saying, no, we own it, would be an authoritative update. And we determined on the select committee that that was the equivalent of a transfer, is effectively a re-register because of how digital assets work in their ownership. And also because, as I mentioned a few minutes ago, no one is going to be checking at any given time if you still own it. There's not going to be any let's check in, because we didn't want to put the burden on the Secretary of State's office. So we thought that was simpler. That said, if you're uncomfortable with that, I don't think we could literally go back to the original bill draft that was presented, probably pull that language that we had back in if it's desirable. Because again, that was just one of those things we talked through and we decided that we liked this way better, but we don't mean to offend.
Representative Western.
Mr. Chairman.
We'll go back to you, Senator Scott.
Senator Scott, I think also another additional thing to keep in mind is under the scenario that Senator Rothfuss has described is, someone, cancels registration, sell the asset, that person comes to re-register. It's also, the Secretary of State also has the authority through this act to say, hey, we see you register this asset, it's currently registered another one. We're going to ask you for more additional information, documentation, proof showing a bill of sale, that type of thing, or some kind of record of transaction showing that it was in fact sold and not stolen or some other scenario.
Back to you, Senator Scott.
Mr. Chairman, I do think that we need to have a requirement that there be a transfer if the ownership ceases, because otherwise I think we have the possibility of misleading the other people that would potentially rely on the fact that this is owned by a specific outfit that is domiciled here in Wyoming. And if the asset is sold, and I would think there was a real likelihood that assets would be sold, I think we need to have notification of that and a requirement for a prompt notification of that, and a mechanism, whether the mechanism is you have to cancel and re-register, whether the mechanism is a transfer mechanism. I'm agnostic on that, but I think allowing a registration to continue after the asset has been sold is overtly misleading to other interested parties, because most of the business filings with the Secretary of State's office, you want to be able to rely on what's there.
Let's let Senator Barlow tack on.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So I think, and Senator Rothfuss, you weren't here, but the premise that this is kind of was presented to us by your colleague representing Western is we're trying to emulate what we have at a county clerk's office for property. And in a county clerk's office for property, if, and I just went through this process, if you purchase property, there's a transfer of deed and you register that with the office, and then the public can examine that record. And if there's a third party that has an interest in leasing an easement, I'm just going to use real property for the moment, or land property, interested in easement, they can go to that record and say, oh, now I see who the owners have been, but now who is the owner? And obviously it requires a timely recording of the deed. And I think this is what my interest is, and the Senator Scott's interest is I think we have to have some understanding of chain of ownership or chain of something so that you can actually, and I'm not saying that the cancellation and transfer isn't a way to do it. I think there has to be a requirement that actually be performed to have access to all these other things, including our courts. You have to actually, follow through with chain of custody or chain of ownership. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I don't know if there's a question in that or not, but reiteration.
So if I point you to a digital asset, right?
Senator Rothfuss, why don't you go ahead?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, if I pointed Senator Barlow at this point in time to a digital asset, you would be able to see its entire transaction history, every ownership, every moment, over time, publicly, in a recordation that would make every county clerk envious, which is why 2 of our county clerks have actually put their property records on blockchain as part of a pilot test in collaboration with our blockchain select committee, because it is the ideal system for recordation and transaction. That recordation and transaction and demonstration of ownership is the integral fundamental feature of blockchain and digital asset transactions as they're done. This bill takes advantage of that and says, all right, this asset is going to be registered as being in Wyoming, but actually tries to stay in some ways out of the actual transaction of ownership a little bit, because that's going to take place through blockchain transactions where you and I could be transacting digital assets right now with our cell phones. It's the recordation part that you mentioned, Senator Barlow and Mr. Chairman, that is sort of the key. What we could do similar to that, though, is on a recordation event, point to a transaction on the blockchain and basically provide an address on the blockchain for that transaction and say, this is the recorded event, and that would be the equivalent of that recordation. On a departure event, the question, and it's kind of implied there, but it's not explicit, so that would be a way to go about doing it, right? Include the transaction of the ownership event that is the attestation. That could be added. If the ownership leaves the state, would they be obligated to re-register the departure? And this was part of the conversation we had, where it's almost problematic to try and bind that. So imagine somebody buys the digital asset, which could happen 10 times today. I register it in the state of Wyoming as a registered digital asset that I own at this moment in time. We could transact without any external oversight, without any clerk, without anything else, 10 times in the same day. Everyone on this committee could own it 2 more times. Having a transference process required because it was registered and keeping track of that is honestly a burden. And it seemed like an unnecessary burden because, again, that'll be blockchain transactions. Once the ownership transfers and it's no longer a registered digital asset in the state of Wyoming as being owned by the individual, we don't know where they are. They haven't attested to being in Wyoming. They don't get the benefits of the state of Wyoming, and they don't have to be in Wyoming. If you want the benefits and you're the owner, you provide the attestation as the owner. It is really, really simple to check if you're still the owner or if another transaction has happened since then. I can show you a transaction log of literally every crypto asset I have. And you would be able to track every moment I transacted in it because all the crypto assets I have are on public blockchains. that's not a problem. But the attestation for a deciding individual or corporation to say, while we own this, we want our asset to be domiciled in Wyoming and we're going to register it, we're going to pay $300, means they're probably going to park it for a little while. But the idea that we would restrict further commerce on that digital asset by requiring transfer or announcement of transfer, it's not the same magnitude of transaction as a house recordation, where you're not going to sell a house 25 times in a day. So the transfer becomes burdensome if we have a transfer fee, whereas the way we have it right now allows, if I do want an authoritative transfer, and Representative Western is going to purchase an asset from me, he's an individual in Wyoming, I'm an individual in Wyoming, I could cancel my registration, or I might not even have to do that realistically. He could register it upon ownership, and it would be authoritative. There's no question it's the same digital asset. Again, it has a unique identifier. When that goes into the Secretary of State's office, it's unambiguous. It absolutely, with certainty, is the same digital asset. They'll know they had it registered to me. They'll know I didn't cancel it, and they'll know that he's registering it now. But at that point, they could check and make sure that, again, he has the authoritative transaction in place. The statute we put forward through the Uniform Commercial Code makes it very clear that if you've got the keys and the control, you are the owner. So authoritatively under Wyoming statute, if he is capable of registering it, he owns it at that moment. And I realize this is all kind of blockchain techie stuff, and I'm sorry that aspect
No,
of
you've
it's
come to the
different.
right committee. We're
Yeah.
the hot stuff on this.
Yeah. Senator Barlow, he has a look on his face of, I don't know what it is, but it's doubt, uncertainty, and bewilderment I'm going to go with.
Which one is it, Senator Barlow?
Yes, Mr. Chairman. Yes, aye. So the statement was just made, and I want to make sure I heard it correctly. If I'm able to register it, it's indisputable, wasn't the word that was used, that I own it. And I think we just had the conversation that if we're not going to have a transferability, you could have somebody register something, but then you have a competing. There could be two of the identical things. You can have a competing thing. So you have two people that now have an indisputable claim to the same property, and then is it first in time, first in right? I mean, this is water law. I can't believe I said that out loud, but so I guess anyway. So anyway, you don't have to go down that road if you don't want to. The other thing is, if we're getting into that, if we're not going to use this as an ownership transferability, then this is no different than a registration thing on your car. We are the manufacturer of this, if you will, on behalf of whoever it is. They are stamping their VIN number. The state is verifying a VIN number. After that, you could register your car in any state, any county, change your ownership, change all this other things. I mean, I'm trying to find an analogy that I can understand, because I do not understand. And by the way, Mr. Chairman, I do not have the capability of reviewing anything that he would potentially send to me. Thank you, Mr.
Let the
Chairman.
record show that he's a veterinarian with a flip phone, an old flip phone. So I think one piece of this that we remember, that the blockchain technology guarantees the ownership and authenticity as it goes along. And that's kind of the whole thing it does. It's the superior mechanism to do that. So unlike asserting that you have, I own this car, you say you own this car, and we have to find out if there were any paperwork about the car, was there implied or whatever, it's ambiguous. With blockchain, if I hold the digital asset, the trail of getting there is available and legitimate. So one of us is going to be right and one of us is going to be wrong, because we're going to be able to prove the trail within the asset itself. That the asset is self-proving. How does that do, Senator Ruffus? Then we're going to let Senator Boner in.
Well, so along those lines, do we need some statutory language to specify that being the case, that basically we're going to defer to that chain of custody or wherever it is? So I think that the concern is you have, the digital assets, it says ownership one thing, the state of Wyoming has something different. Shouldn't there be some reference in statute to saying, we'll acknowledge whatever the blockchain says?
Senator Ruffus.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Senator, that's not in this bill. That's in Senate File 159. What was it? From about 4 years ago, I want to say 5 years ago. That it was one of the foundational pieces, and it's where we mapped digital asset language onto the Uniform Commercial Code so that it could appropriately reflect property rights and established the standing of those cryptographic signatures and the authenticity of that transaction, where basically that blockchain ownership thread and that instantaneous ability to demonstrate ownership, which is a unique feature of blockchain, where I can prove to you I own something, even if you didn't look at the chain of transactions on the blockchain, I can still prove to you cryptographically that it's mine, which is just a cool little mathematical feature where if you want to go into that at some point, let me know.
It's a pretty neat conversation, actually. So let's just telegraph everybody's intentions. I think Mr. Meyer might want to testify on this bill. I'm not sure. I'm not sure if we have anybody online. So we don't have anybody online. It's 9:15. I'd like to finish this bill today and give the members a chance to get up to the chamber and get settled without pushing it too hard. So I'd like to stop at 9:45. You have the time.
Thank you.
So should we finish going through the bill, or?
Where were you?
7.
Gotcha.
Mr.
Go
Chairman.
ahead, continue.
So it's top of page 7, the 3429-207 talks about just cancellation of registration, as Senator Rothfuss was alluding to, and those terms and conditions. Obviously, there's a $30 cancellation fee. It kind of talks about, certainly the Chancery Court has the ability to intervene. Any registration, if a court of common jurisdiction finds that the registrant is not the owner, the registrant was granted improperly, the registration was obtained fraudulently, it gives the courts the ability, or our Chancery Court, to nullify any of that ownership. Moving on to page 9, false or fraudulent representations, liability. Any person who finds himself or on behalf of any other person files or registers any digital asset in the office of the Secretary under the provisions of this article by knowingly making a false, fraudulent representation or declaration, orally or in writing, or by other means, shall be liable, which is similar to some of the other language we have when submitting some of these forms to the Secretary of State's office. The next section, 209, talks about the powers of the Secretary of State, filing and other fees. I think a crucial point is on page 10 is B, the Secretary shall set and collect registration services and copy fees to recover the cost of providing these services and administer this act. So you shall not exceed the cost of providing these services and administering this act. And I wish the good Secretary was here, because we know how he's concerned about financial matters, knowing that this is not going to be a burden on taxpayers and public dollars, that this will be a self-sustaining operation by those fees. Moving on to section 115, purpose and jurisdiction, talking about the Chancery Court, kind of delineating some sideboards on the court. And moving on to page 10, talking about the Secretary shall promulgate some of these rules, and of course, the effective date. So that pretty much covers it. Of course, stand for any further questions.
Okay, thank you very much, Representative Western. Senator Scott.
Mr. Chairman, and I'm still trying to understand this critter. So when they register with the Secretary of State. They're attesting that they own it at the time. And they're subject to the jurisdiction of the state of Wyoming. And what you're saying is the blockchain then, as they sell it, gives you a chain of custody, if you will, of the asset that people can always trace back. So what the effect of the registration is to subject it to Wyoming law in case there's a dispute. It does not attest anything other than ownership at the time of registration, and it remains under subject to Wyoming jurisdiction until it gets canceled. How difficult is it for somebody to say, okay, we're trying to transact business with you. We want to know that you really do own that asset because it's part of what we're relying on. Can a bank, how do they check through that chain of title to make sure that you own it? Because they can't rely on the registration.
Mr. Chairman, Senator Scott, that's a great question. Again, coming back to just how blockchain technology works, they can absolutely say, hey, we need to see the code showing from this blockchain showing that you are the owner, that there was a transfer of ownership or that kind of nature. So they can ask and say, hey, we need to see the hard data that shows, that backs up the claims of the person making the application.
So it'd be like you had a title, and within that title, when you open it up, it proves everything about how the title got there. And it would be on paper, but this does it with, in a digital manner, encrypted. So if I say, if Senator Landon and I have a transaction and it moves to him, he now has the title. It proves how we got there. And it's verifiable. It's unassailable according to conventional thinking that it is a perfect proof as much as we can be. So I think that might be the way to think about it. You guys are welcome to add. Senator Rothfuss.
Thank you. Backing up to just an earlier comment about it remains a Wyoming asset. The way this is structured, it's only subject to the system if that owner remains a Wyoming LLC or individual. So the moment they transfer it, if I were going to use the Chancery Court, I would no longer have standing if I had purchased it. If I'm somebody in New Hampshire and I purchase it, I don't have that standing anymore because unless I bought the LLC. If I bought the LLC is domiciled in Wyoming. If I buy it individually, according to this, I would no longer have standing. Even though it had been registered in Wyoming, it is not a Wyoming registered digital asset any longer because I would not be able to prove that I was that Wyoming registered owner. And I think that's just an important point. If I register it in Wyoming, I need to keep owning it as Wyoming if there's a transaction again. And that's why, since we're only Wyoming and transactions will go elsewhere, the transferability becomes a problem because I might well transfer it to somebody outside the state. They're not going to register a transfer. They're not going to register anything. So I think it's important to realize once I sell the asset to somebody who would not be eligible to register it, or really once I sell that asset at that point in time, if it's not owned in Wyoming, it would be no longer a registered digital asset. There's not a registered ownership as a Wyoming person or entity. As far as that transaction though, Chairman, you I think perfectly described it. At any given time with blockchain technology on open blockchains, which these are requiring open blockchains, which means transparent, you can read it all. and you can see the moment of every transaction. And with every transaction, you know, authoritative owners, and I can prove at any given time that I am the asset owner and the entire custody chain beforehand. A lot of the counterfeiting and fraud kind of comes pre-registration, and it's an important part of this, which is that if you've registered your own NFT or digital asset, and I do something like Chairman Case said, and I effectively copy it and then try to re-register it somewhere else, there's going to be some jurisdictional and fraud concerns with the fact that I've got a knockoff copy. It's not the original. But there's some pretty good provability on that. The moment that I register it on a blockchain, I have the ultimate timestamp. If I registered a digital asset in any way on a blockchain, whether it's in Wyoming or not, that moment in time is provable in history. And so coming to a court like our Chancery Court and saying, no, I registered or I transacted with this digital asset first is very provable. Now, the courts in other jurisdictions might not know what to do with that information. But again, that's why we're trying to train up our Chancery Court so that they understand the importance of those types of transactions.
So just, again, thinking we got about 20 minutes left. The Secretary of State had pushed back a little bit. We discussed whether they would need more time for rules. You can imagine what they said, yes. And they had proposed an amendment to delete the word cryptographically on page 2, line 21. So need you to just talk about those proposed ideas. There may be other questions from the committee, but.
Mr. Chairman, it's almost meaningless if you take off cryptographically, because if the intent is to not cryptographically register it, we shouldn't be doing this. A cryptographic registration means that you're using blockchain type technology to do digital signatures that are encrypted. It's called public key, private key encryption. It's a very well-established.
Goes back more than a decade.
Goes back, does it go back longer than me? Not quite. So not quite as long as I've been alive, and definitely not as long as Senator Scott has, but it goes back quite a while. Public key, private key. It's the basis for all of our banking transactions. Those signatures and the structure that you use with them in a blockchain are authoritative and time-stamped. If we established a non-cryptographically signed registration system, I can't imagine the chaos that would ensue. So I'd probably then vote against that bill because it would be a disaster to not have blockchain authority underlying our digital asset registration. Be scary.
Okay, let's get Senator Barlow, and then we'll come back to the time they would have for rulemaking. Senator Barlow.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So actually, and I appreciate the explanation, and the interesting, I think there's actually a sentence structure issue with this, because I would actually suggest that you want the entirety of the registration certificate to be cryptographic and the signature, not just the signature, because the way I read this is, anyway, I know there may be part and parcel, but I think that the sentence structure should probably provide a.
And this is just by the line 21 is about the registration certificate that the Secretary of State gives. It's not about how the information is held. And I'm not sure, Representative Western.
Mr. Chairman, Senator Barlow, just for point of clarification, you're asking if the signature needs to be cryptographic or if the whole component does need to be?
Mr. Chairman, so my assumption is the entirety of the certificate is cryptographic. It just happens to also be signed. And the way this could be read, and like I said, I don't think it has a practical application, but you can have a certificate and it has to be cryptographically signed. I would rather have a cryptographic registration certificate, period. And it would be issued by the Secretary of State. So signature is irrelevant because issuance is the needed thing. So I think cryptographically if it is the most important thing, then it's either placed incorrectly or, anyways, it seems to be placed incorrectly for me.
Yeah, it seems to be just tied to the signature. So
Mr. Chairman?
We throw it back to you guys.
Yep. So if you were to put cryptographically signed ahead of registration certificate, perhaps that would satisfy Senator Barlow. I don't have the concern because the way a cryptographic signature works kind of in the art, you take whatever your input is, which can be open text, and that's what you'd want, right? You just want a series of facts that are plain text that you could read digitally. You take the whole thing and you cryptographically sign that, which literally means you include all of it in your signature, and that becomes authoritative. And so it's a mathematical algorithm where you do something called a hash, and you take, which takes all of the input and takes it down to a little bit of small 256-bit code, and you integrate that code into the signature. And what that allows you to do is if any bit of this original text is changed, it falsifies the rest. So it cannot be changed without the signature saying it's false. All of this has to be exactly right, and it's time stamped as well. So a lot of information goes into it, and that's what we're talking about when we say a cryptographic signature. The cryptographically signed means exactly what Senator Barlow wants it to mean in terms of, or wants it to accomplish, I guess I should say.
I'm kind of at the same thing. It's sort of like, okay. I think this is a point that it's got to sink in some more. But I can tell you that it hasn't sunk in with the Secretary of State's office either, so you got some work to do there.
Understood. And I did spend some time with Secretary Gray, as hopefully he noted, to walk through this. But yes, and again, it is all cutting edge. It's all very complicated and new, and that's the reason why there's a lot of opportunity for us, because we have the good fortune of having some folks working on this right now.
Senator Barlow.
Mr. Chairman, so I'm not, I don't know what the concern the Secretary of State has, except for the cost of the cryptographic and the implementation. I don't know that he didn't understand the value of it, but that is, I'm not going to over try to communicate what the
Yeah,
Secretary said.
he's not present, but they had suggested to delete that word.
Yeah, the suggestion was to delete it. I don't know that it was for the same purposes that we're talking about here. So thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Perfect. And what about the rulemaking? Because the Secretary of State, on a line of questioning, I think from Senator Scott, or I'm not sure, can't remember exactly, it was that they might need more time for rulemaking.
So October 1st?
Oh,
December? I don't know, pick a date, give him a couple months.
Senator Scott, do you remember that?
He did want more time in the rulemaking,
Okay.
just on the theory they're complicated, I think. And our process is cumbersome.
Yeah.
Senator Rothfuss.
Mr. Chairman, and no problem, I don't know if you requested a little or how much additional time. I do understand that he's staffing up. He has some work challenges that might lead to some requirements for additional time. Development of the API is not that challenging or time consuming, but it's not easy either, so that'll take a little bit of time. It's not a Herculean effort. That's what the $270-ish thousand is to build that out. And perhaps the reason for the desire to not have the cryptographic signature would be that it would be less expensive. That is true, that it would be less expensive to not have a cryptographic signature, but it would also be a useless product. So I understand.
Okay, so we'll see Senator Landon and then Senator Scott.
So real quickly in that regard, I know we want to wrap this up, but Senator Rothfuss, that was an issue well, I'm slowly getting to where I can understand why there would be a value in registering these assets in Wyoming. Still not quite there. And I got a smile on page 7 when we talk about 5 years and you have an opportunity to renew this after you told me that you could sell it 5 times today. So I'm trying to get there on that front too. I'll come back to just a couple of comments, and that's probably good enough. I'm going to stop right there. Thank you.
Senator Scott.
Mr. Chairman, and I've been trying to understand this. Clearly, you're not registering with the Secretary of State to prove ownership. So that's, we don't need to have it record every transfer. It does strike me that what you are trying to do with the registration is to get clear, this is where you go to court when there's a row. And I think that has to continue even if the new owner is outside the state of Wyoming. If they want to avoid that, you've got a mechanism where they cancel it. But until they do that, they can say, look, this is a Wyoming registered, and that should tell people that if there's a dispute, Wyoming's courts is where you go. And if we're the only game in town that does that, that might be very valuable, Mr. Chairman. So if the provision is they lose that advantage as soon as somebody outside Wyoming owns it, then I don't think this has been thought out and Mr. Chairman is not quite yet ready for prime time. Tell me what I'm missing. And Mr. Chairman, I do want to hear from the bankers really quick.
Mr. Chairman?
And we will. Senator Rothfuss, we're going to, you do this, and then we're going to hear from
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Meyer.
Thank you, Senator Scott. This was discussed extensively, the idea of whether or not we wanted to apply outside of the state. Cryptocurrency and digital assets and anything in this space can be owned by anybody on the planet 2 minutes from now in a transaction. And people that we can't identify unless they opt in to ownership, there would be no capacity for service of process after the transfer. There would be no capacity for searches, investigation, anything else. If you don't have at least one of the parties where you can go walk up to them and point to someone or something, because we've literally got it in our books through a validation step, you can't do this. And that's why we established it the way we did. We have to have a human, we have to have a something. And we know that even with LLCs, through the registered agent, we have some capacity to engage with the asset. It was a very intentional and thought through aspect of this legislation that if you're the owner of the digital asset, you register it in Wyoming, and while you're maintained as the owner of that digital asset, then you have access to our system. We need that series of checkboxes in place before I think the state of Wyoming wants to be on the hook for trying to legally work through that. If you transfer it to somebody in Novosibirsk and they're the owner, I don't think we want to be on the hook for our court system being accessible. So when you sue that person in Novosibirsk, you come to the Wyoming courts and the Wyoming system and the Wyoming law enforcement, and you say, hey, we need you to get us back this asset. We have no hooks. We have nobody.
Let's wrap it up.
Thank you.
Okay. Let's get public comment. Mr. Meyer, did you want to make public comment?
No, please. All right.
Members of the committee, Scott Meyer with the Wyoming Bankers Association. I believe Senator Scott did a very good job of kind of summarizing kind of where they are. I think that this bill has a lot more further tentacles out there. It's got a lot more ramifications out there. I want to go back real quickly and just to a comment that Senator Barlow talked about with respect to like deeds. I can sign a deed over to Senator Barlow on some real property. And I can do, and that deed is effective then. It doesn't have to be recorded. That deed is there. I give it to you. But I can also turn around and do the same thing to Senator Case and say, here, I'm going to give you the same property. By recording it, you have given notice to the world that this is what I've done. So I think in that same sense, as Senator Scott says, we're not saying this is a definitive ownership of this property, but we are giving notice to the people, to the world, that this is a Wyoming asset. And as Senator Rothfuss says, that comes with it a lot of benefits to us, maybe some burdens too, but a lot of benefits to us because it is now subject to a Wyoming Chancery Court or what have you. But give this some consideration too. Hypothetically speaking, if a bank were to lend money on, with collateral being some digital asset, and if that loan is now in default, how do we deal with that? Well, with this statute, we know we're dealing with a Wyoming asset. We're not trying to deal with an asset someplace else. By registering that asset with the Secretary of State, we know that we are dealing with a Wyoming asset. So that eliminates the problem of what do we do? Is that asset really in New Jersey? Is it on the cloud in some computer in California? We don't know. We know what this is. The second thing to think about also is taxation. There's a lot of states that tax on unearned income, like interest and what have you, but there are a whole lot of taxing schemes out there. Is this asset something now that is subject to tax in New Jersey or Georgia or wherever? Now we've definitively said this is a Wyoming asset, and it may or may not have any impact, but it may have a great deal of impact on how something is taxed. Third thing I'd bring up to you is, we talked a little bit about this when we talked about digital keys and what have you, but in probate, what asset is subject to the Wyoming courts in probate? I don't know where this digital asset is. I may have an argument that this is not subject to Wyoming probate, or maybe I'm trying to make it. This registration, in my opinion, as I look at it, makes this a Wyoming asset. Now I have subject to now the courts, the probate courts in Wyoming have jurisdiction over the Wyoming asset. So I think that this is a very good thing. The only thing that I question, and I still haven't got my head wrapped around, is why the 5 years? I don't have to go record my deed for the real property that I sold every 5 years. I don't have to do a UCC's as periodically. There is some requirements under UCC's to update those, but my point is, if I'm going to make this a Wyoming asset, then I'm going to register it as that, and as long as I still own it, I would keep it there. That's my only question. But other than that, the Wyoming Bankers Association stands in support of this bill, and I would answer any questions.
Thank you, Mr. Meyer. Questions for Mr. Meyer? Thank you, sir. Anybody else in this room like to testify on this bill? Anybody else in this room? Is there anybody online? We're lucky because we're running out of time. So committee, last thing, Senator Ruffus, we are right up against the deadline.
I would just say that there's no reason to keep the renewal fee if the committee doesn't want the renewal fee. I mean, pursuant to what Scott said. That was just kind of let's keep a little bit of track of it and make sure they still own it every 5 years. But again, with the blockchain providing the determination of ownership, it's easy. The other thing, Mr. Chairman, you could literally set up an automated feature where the moment that somebody else purchased it, a flag went up and the Secretary of State's office knew. That's not in this bill, but that's about 8 minutes of coding.
Interesting. Committee, you've heard the testimony. What is your pleasure on the bill? Do I get a motion on the bill? Motion by Barlow. Discussion? We've heard possible remove the word cryptographically. Does anyone wish to offer that? Nope. So that hasn't happened. We heard a discussion about giving the Secretary of State's office more time for rules. Anybody want to offer that?
I would offer an amendment to December 1st, 2023.
So your microphone's not on, but Senator Landon offered an amendment to change the rulemaking time to December 1st of 2023. Senator Barlow.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I recall that we had a bill already pass the Senate, and if it passed, the entire system actually changes the Chancery Court a date. I think that was another date, and I can't remember where it went out to, and I was going through there. So, I mean, if we're going to implement this, we would want them to also have access to the court that we're specifying in this. So we have two choices, Mr. Chairman. We either synchronize it with the Chancery Court date or whatever that app where we anticipate it being available, or we say district court or Chancery Court as available. Mr.
I
Chairman.
think the latter would be better. I think time is of the essence on getting this. Senator Rothfuss, I'm sorry. The maker of the motion gets to respond.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. The other bill, just as a reminder, our chancery courts are up and running.
Yeah.
And the district court judges are covering that court as we speak. And all we did was to extend the sunset or extend the requirement that we seat an actual chancery judge. So I think we're fine on that
I
front.
don't think we need.
And so back to the motion, it just was October 1st, and I'm suggesting we go to December 1st. Mr. Chairman.
Any comment from the sponsors? Okay, you've heard the motion. All in favor, say aye. That is carried. Any opposed, I should say, but that is carried. Back on the bill, is there anything about the renewal fee? Anybody want to address that? That was the 5-year renewal, $150, up to $150. Suggestion is maybe we don't really need it. Seems to be indifferent. Not hearing anybody offer the motion. Is there any other motion on the bill? How about the appropriations? Should we just refer to appropriations?
Mr. Chairman, that would be my recommendation.
Senator Scott's recommendation is just to refer to appropriations. Senator Landon.
That's pretty, Mr. Chairman, I would be willing to go with Senator Scott on that. I would be, I think, more inclined to put the 270,000 in there. I think it would expedite the process of heading to appropriations with it. If you leave it open-ended, you're kind of at the mercy of the other committee. That's all I would say there.
Mr. Chairman, so I'd move the amendment offered by Senator Rothfuss for the appropriation.
Okay, discussion? And it does change the title, appropriately so. I think that's not deceptive data. So, discussion on the amendment? All those in favor of the amendment signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Opposed, no. Amendment is carried. Back on the bill. Anything else on the bill? Debbie, would you call the roll?
Senator Barlow? Senator Boner? Senator Landon?
Aye.
Senator Scott?
No.
And Mr. Chairman.
Senator Scott, I almost thought we had you, so I was ready to follow you, but I'm going to go aye. Well, thank you. Thanks for all the jiggling today and everybody's indulgence. It's kind of the way we roll.
Thanks for
We're
the
done with
patience
all
too.
the
Thank you.
committee bills. We'll be stacking up personal bills, and we're getting a lot of them. We did manage to shed the EMT special district bill, so it's a little bit smaller on our list. We'll see you on Tuesday. Thank you, guys. Good work.